Welcome to the first opening keynote speech by Gordon Osinski. Gordon is not Polish, although his, I think, grandfather was from Poland. Yes. Gordon is a geologist and planetary scientist with a very wide variety of interests, mostly focusing on surface processes of multiple different planetary bodies. He's a professor at the University of Western Ontario and director of Lunar Research Network, Canadian Lunar Research Network. I am very excited to say that he very recently won a very, very prestigious Barringer Medal that is given to the best planetary scientists and geologists in the field. Very well-deserved thing. What is especially close to my heart, he's very involved also in outreach activities, including, let's call it outreach, teaching the future, teaching astronauts, actual astronauts, including Canadian ones, but I think also American ones, how to do geology and how to do geology in the field, which is very impressive. And maybe he will mention something about that if there is time, or maybe you can ask him questions. So Gordon, the floor is yours. Please share your presentation and yes.
Okay, well, yes, good evening. It's just turned good afternoon for me here in Canada, and it's a pleasure to open today's lecture. So let's so it looks like after hearing Thomas do that at the beginning, we did not test the slides here, so you might just need to give me a couple of seconds to get these slides uploaded.
Let's hope it will work. In case there are any technical problems, I'm sure we will get proper help from Justyna Pels, which is our technical wizard.
Just said the file was too big, so give me 1 second.
Yes, so I will maybe tell a little bit more about Oz and his work. He's the most well-known in our community from doing the from doing a lot of studies on impact cratering, and this is how we know each other, because that's also my favorite topic. He was doing a lot of studies in high Arctic in Canada, including combining the high Arctic environment with the impact cratering topic, and this is also where he was doing a lot of training of the astronauts. So very interesting thing. I think Justyna is saying that you should just share the presentation, no need to upload it. Oh, I'm very sorry for the slight technical problems. I hope it will not come back later on.
Hi guys. So this is, typical for the online conferences that we do have to deal with technical issues. So the best practice for sharing your presentation is usually sharing the full screen, not only the window of the application that you are sharing with, but the actual whole screen of your computer. That makes it usually more stable. And when you're presenting, it's a little bit different on a Hopin than the platform that we are using right now, streaming to Hopin. But in general, there is a button that says share your screen, and that should be sufficient. So please go before your presentation to the test room and try out how that works. And for now, just give us a few minutes and we will be back with the presenter.
Does the sharing of the screen works?
Let's give it a go, shall we?
Perfect.
Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen. Just going to change this.
Just please put it in the presentation.
There. Are we good to go?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Well, everyone, that is a lesson for all the presenters. Please check that you have sharing permissions, because for many, this is a new platform for me, unlike Zoom and Microsoft Teams and things. Anyway, so everybody can hear me, Anya? I'm good to go? Okay, I will assume that is a yes. So it's a pleasure to be here this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are, to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the role of meteorite impacts and the origin of life. Before I begin, I'd like to give a special thanks to 3 people who I've collaborated with over almost a couple of decades now on this topic. Charlie Cicxulub from the University of Edinburgh, who's well known in European astrobiology, and 2 former PhD students, Alex Pontefract and Haley Sapers. So let's start big picture. If you look up, image of the solar system in any search engine, you'll come across many different variations, but I chose this one a long time ago because it really demonstrates the fact that, our solar system is not empty. The artist has kindly drawn in here the asteroid belt between the orbits of Jupiter and Mars. If you've got a good screen and or good eyes, you'll see a lot of other dots in the close proximity to Earth. And those will be the near-Earth asteroids or near-Earth object class. And then, of course, you have a comet coming in from the outer solar system. We'll get to Earth in a second, but if you look up at the moon, even on a clear night without the aid of a telescope, you can see that impact cratering really dominates the surface of this object. There are literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of meteorite impact craters. So asteroids and comets that have struck the surface of the moon over the last 4.5 billion years and do continue to do so today. Earth actually has a bigger gravitational cross-section than the moon, so we should actually look worse off than the moon. But of course, as you probably know, Earth is geologically active, and it's given, I think, this false idea of the lack of meteorite impacts on Earth. But I think we have learned in recent times that impact cratering is really an important geological process for the Earth. Of course, what you may think when you came into this talk, if you hear the word impact, meteorite impact, asteroids, comets, is maybe one of these 2 images. If you're around in the late 90s, when we had a couple of movies, Armageddon and Deep Impact, that I think kind of brought asteroid impacts to Hollywood's attention. Or perhaps, most famously, why impacts are probably known about is the formation of the Chicxulub crater in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and the associated mass extinction of 2/3 of all life on Earth. And so the destructive power of meteorite impacts, I think, is relatively well known. This is a simple plot from a famous book by Bevan French, Traces of Catastrophe. And on the y-axis, you have essentially how frequently various events are occurring, and on the x-axis, the energy in tons of TNT equivalent, and it's in megatons. It's not a good metric unit, but it's due to a lot of our information about impacts actually comes from the nuclear tests of the 1960s and 70s, particularly in terms of the environmental destruction. And so you can see that even, Meteor Crater, which is a relatively small impact crater by solar system standards, which is 1.2 kilometers across, yields, a couple of orders of magnitude more energy than the weapons dropped on Japan at the end of the Second World War. And so if you've seen pictures of the aftermath in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we're talking 2 orders of magnitude more energy. So bad news day, right, if you're in the path of a meteorite impact. And that's actually led to some, classic papers in the 90s in particular, the impact frustration for the origin of life, the annihilation of ecosystems by large asteroid impacts on early Earth. And so associated with that, in the bottom right, you'll see a plot of impact of flux with time. There's a whole bunch of squiggly lines on this plot. We don't really know exactly which one is true yet, and it's part of the motivation for going back to the moon, even for astrobiology, I would add, because we want to get at what was the impact rate in the first 500 million years of Earth's history when life started on our planet. But regardless, we know that early on there were more impacts than at the present day. So if we look at a nice again, picture of time and major events, we're talking about this Hadean period. So the first kind of 700 million years of Earth's history to about 3.8 billion years. So the far end of the plot on the left. If you Google Hadean, you'll get plot in artist renditions, because of course we have no rocks really from that time, of this kind of hellish-like environment. And, the word Hadean comes from the Greek god of the underworld, Hades, and also the Greek god of death. And, we have this perception of a very hellish early environment, volcanoes happening, hot surface, and lots of impacts occurring. But the contradicting evidence is that we have growing evidence for life, actually even greater than 3.8, potentially back to 4.1 billion years. So the question is perhaps not how, but how, why, when did life evolve during this most inhospitable time in Earth's history? So I want to throw out a hypothesis to you today, which is that, far from being destructive, is that meteorite impact craters can generate the conditions suitable for the emergence of life through the production of substrates, through the delivery of life essential elements, and through the production of habitats for life. And so that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not going to be able to cover all of these in any detail, but I'm going to touch on some of the research in particular that I've been involved in over the last decade or two. And so most of my research in astrobiology is coming from the perspective of doing geology here on Earth. And a lot of my work still starts in the field. And so when we think about the impact record of Earth, this is one of the iconic images from one of the first Apollo missions. Looking back at Earth, we've got most recent ones, right, from Orion, which are just truly spectacular. But this perspective in particular, looking at the continent of Africa and the Southern Ocean, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that, impacts happen at all, let alone played a big role in our history. But we do have a growing cratering record on Earth. All the red dots are hypervelocity impact craters. There's 188 confirmed. We have a number of craters that we think are from hypervelocity impact, or they may be too small to create shock. And then a whole series of impact deposits, many of which we don't actually know the association, or the host crater has been eroded long ago. So we do have a good record. It's places where we can go and do field work, collect samples, bring them back into our lab and analyze. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to impactearth.com. And this is both a research and an outreach project that you can yeah, spend hours and hours looking at the map and exploring all the impact craters on Earth. And again, if you want some bedtime reading, we've got a largish review paper just published a couple of months ago in Earth Science Reviews that goes through this impact record of Earth. So what I'm going to focus in on for most of the talk today are impact-generated habitats for life. And so what I mean by that is that these are habitats from microbial life that would not have existed if it were not for the impact event. And I'm going to start with hydrothermal systems. So many of you, being astrobiologists, may have done or do work on hydrothermal systems on Earth. Active hydrothermal systems, they're a source of ongoing research into extremophiles. This is Yellowstone, a very famous system. Essentially, hydrothermal systems comes from two Greek words. You put a heat source together with water, you get hydrothermal fluid flow, convection, the dissolution of rocks and minerals in one location, and typically the precipitation where these fluids cool off at some different level in the Earth's crust, and or where they vent onto the surface. And we know from decades of work into these hydrothermal systems in these volcanically active regions that they are prime kind of hotspots for life, and then maybe where we think life originated on Earth and other planets. It turns out, and we're actually in the process of finishing off a new review on this, because this is 20 years ago, 2002 review paper where Mikhail Normov kind of reviewed our knowledge then of impact-generated hydrothermal systems. We know of a lot more places on Earth, craters on Earth where hydrothermal activity has been documented. All of these craters highlighted in red are ones that my group has been studying for the last decade or so. Not going to talk about them all, but I'm going to take you to one of the most spectacular ones, which is up here in the Canadian Arctic. And this is actually what brought me over to Canada from the UK after my undergraduate in St Andrews in Scotland, all the way up to about 75 degrees north on Devon Island in the Canadian Arctic. So if you've never been this far north, particularly in Canada, this is what it looks like. It is a spectacular place to do any science, but particularly great for doing geology because it's a polar desert environment. So there's some tiny little patches of alteration. I don't know if you can see my mouse here on the left-hand side, of vegetation, but most of this is a polar desert. It's a very cold desert environment, which makes it ideal for exploring the geology of this 23-kilometer diameter meteorite impact crater. The crater formed 31 million years ago, which geologically speaking, particularly here in the Arctic, is almost like yesterday, so it's very well preserved. This is the view you get out of the plane window, the Twin Otter, that brings you into this site, lands on just gravel. A truly spectacular environment. Not always like this. This is actually what it looks out of my window today. I'm not sure what it's like in Poland or wherever else you are in the world. This is Canada Day in early 2000s, so July 1st. So you can still have weather to contend with. And in case you're wondering, yes, we do occasionally get polar bears that come into camp and also, create different conditions for doing field work, let's say. Okay, and so actually this map dates back to my PhD, although we're continually updating it. But one of the things we did was just create a geological map of this crater for the first time. This is a very simplified geological map that is focused on these hydrothermal deposits. And essentially, I'm going to draw your attention to all the little red dots on this geological map. Of course, for a hydrothermal system, you also need a heat source. And so in meteorite impacts, there are two main heat sources. The first and the most common for most craters is the rocks that were melted. Impact events deposit huge amounts of energy into the crust of any planetary object. And so a lot of that energy is transferred into heat that melts sometimes multi-cubic kilometers of rock. So think of a large lava pool, sat there on the surface of the planet in question. In bigger craters, you can actually you get what we call central uplifts, where rocks are brought from sometimes 10, 20 kilometers depth to the surface. And so you've actually uplifted the geothermal gradient in these regions. At Horton, because of its size, we're really primarily, the primary heat source are these impact melt rocks, which are colored here in orange. We do have a central uplift that is shaded here in this kind of deeper purple color. So those are rocks that have been uplifted from depth and also heavily fractured and faulted. And so that's the other, good thing about meteorite impacts and why they generate hydrothermal systems, is that you also need a pathway to get, the fluids from point A to point B. And the faults and fractures generated by impacts do a great job of that. So we're now going to jump in. Before I move on from this map, I'll just draw your attention to the fact that these hydrothermal deposits highlighted in all the red symbols are not, it's not homogeneous, right? And it's not random. There are discrete zones in the crater where hydrothermal fluids are focused. So one of the first ones is actually towards the base of this layer of impact melt rock in the crater center. This is one of the most spectacular locations. It's there's a rock hammer there for scale, and this is a big hydrothermal vug. So essentially it's a cavity that is lined by mineralization. You've got this really nice green mineral, which is marcasite, iron sulfide. There's lots of carbonates here. For the Martians in the audience, the yellow kind of popcorn-like substance is actually jarosite. So that's a hydrated iron-bearing sulfate that is actually a weathering product of the sulfides. And jarosite created quite a lot of interest when it was first discovered on Mars a few years ago. We also get spectacular deposits of gypsum, the transparent variety, which is selenite. Not as fantastic as the crystal caves in Mexico that you might have seen with, person-sized crystals, but these are getting up for 30, 40, 50 centimeters long. The selenite was deposited in kind of the waning stages of the hydrothermal system at Horton. So I mentioned already that rock impact events do a lot of fracturing. And this is an image from around the edge of the central uplift, where you're looking at the bright white mineral here is calcite, and you're looking at sets of veins coming out of your screen, and one that is parallel to the Swiss Army knife there. And then the final one, which is probably the least interesting to look at in the field, which I think, but what I think is perhaps most interesting astrobiologically, are these two iron-stained pipe-like structures. They occur only around the crater rim, and we think these are essentially feeders for what would have been hydrothermal vents that would have been a few tens of meters above where we are eroded today. So putting together the observations from Horton, a number of other craters, we've kind of come up with this schematic diagram of a crater on Earth, something on the order of 50 to 150 kilometers across, be a bit bigger for Mars because of its lower gravity. Where there are all some variation of this, where you have a complex crater rim and some kind of central uplift. And just quickly, some of the more interesting regions, we have hydrothermal alteration of ejecta deposits, which I haven't talked about, which is interesting because you can get that material thrown out for tens, hundreds, even thousands of kilometers by big impacts. We get a lot of alteration. Number one is these vugs and veins within the melt rocks. We don't see this at Horton, but a really interesting location for astrobiology, which I have a student just finishing up looking at the Ries crater in Germany, is number 6 here, which is there's evidence at the Ries where you had a crater lake forming right after the impact, that we had hydrothermal vents into the base of this crater lake, and actually hydrothermal alteration of the first initial sediments that were being laid down. And so, as you can imagine, you've got a protected environment, lots of nutrients coming in from these hydrothermal vents, and enhanced temperatures. So a really interesting habitat for life. Why is all of this important? Well, I kind of hinted at it at the beginning, but it's bin known for a number of years now. There is debate, of course. I'm not saying there isn't. Perhaps life emerged in a colder environment. But I think we do think still, a lot of folks think that life on Earth started in hydrothermal systems, perhaps we're leaning towards more subaerial hydrothermal systems versus, under the ocean. But it boils down to the fact that our current knowledge of the tree of life, if you come down to the root, this is a nice version that is color-coded. And so the color code red there is organisms called thermophiles, so heat-loving organisms that only, live and grow at temperatures above 90 degrees Celsius. And so, a human would not do very well in such a system, but these are organisms that are literally thriving in such systems. And of course, at Yellowstone now, I think the record is still 124 degrees Celsius when I last checked. But, that's the current upper limit for life in such hydrothermal systems. And basically, the point here is that, in addition to hydrothermal systems produced by volcanism, volcanic activity, magma sources at depth, it seems like, I think, most impacts over a certain size threshold, a few kilometers, on an object where you have volatiles, and it could even be frozen on the surface of Mars, for example, can create hydrothermal systems. And so I think this opens up an exciting door for, hydrothermal activity even on asteroids, where you might only have had impacts with no volcanism because they were so small. Okay, and so moving on now, I'm going to talk about a couple of other really interesting habitats. This first one has come also out of our work from the Horton Impact Crater in Devon Island. So some of you might be familiar with endoliths. So, lots of words in geology that derive from Greek. So endo, within, and, lithic, rock. And so endoliths are microorganisms that live within the rock. They were first documented in Antarctica. This paper is not the first documenting, but it's got a great figure here where you've broken open a rock, split it with a rock hammer, and under some depth underneath the surface, you have a layer of green cyanobacteria. These organisms in Antarctica and the dry valleys are, living within the rock because it's a shield from high UV flux. It's also moisture retentive and protects the organisms from the huge temperature swings. And, while not as extreme as Mars, those are also similar challenges for organisms on the surface of Mars. So this particular rock here is a sandstone. That's where they were first found. That's where endoliths by far are the most common. And that's because they're mostly photosynthetic. And so you need a porosity to get water into there and enough translucence so that sunlight can still penetrate down a certain distance. So what we discovered at Horton, and Charlie Coquel's first paper on this in 2003, was that it's not as spectacular, but in the bottom right image, hopefully you can see a faint layer of pink and then of green closer to the surface in this particular rock. Why this is interesting is that this rock is a gneiss. So this is a high-grade metamorphic rock. It's a chunk of the Canadian Shield, 3 billion years old, that before the impact was completely dense and non-porous. And, nobody's ever found endoliths or cryptoendoliths in a gneiss before. And so what the impact has done has taken something that was uninhabitable and made it habitable. And so we'll jump in now to show you exactly kind of what's going on at the grain scale. Just to summarize, what you've done is taken this original gneiss, you've increased the porosity and the translucence. And so Alex Pontefract, who did her PhD with me and actually worked in Charlie Coquel's lab, we took these gneisses, we categorized them into various different shock levels. And I'll show you some images in a second so you can see actually what the rocks look like. But essentially 0 means the rock is unshocked. And going up to shock stage 7 is a rock that's almost completely melted. What we did was to take these samples of the gneiss, we sterilized them and basically did culturing experiments. And so essentially the y-axis is the average number of cells per gram, and the x-axis is, increasing shock level from left to right. And hopefully you can see, a pretty good correlation with increasing biomass with increasing shock level. Excuse me. And so I'm going to show 3 backscattered electron images from a scanning electron microscope. Essentially here, grayscale represents different elements in the periodic table. But what you're looking at here are images that are about 2 millimeters across. And you can see in this image that, there's very little fracture space, very little porosity. And this is what a nice high-grade metamorphic rock should look like. When you get to kind of medium shock levels, you start to introduce a lot of fractures into this gneiss. So you can see all the black here is essentially fractures. You're starting to break up the rock. Nutrients, water can get into this particular rock. As you get to this shock stage 7, the rock has, the closest analogy I can give you is pumice. So pumice produced in volcanic eruptions, that very light, frothy material, so light that it actually floats in water. So it's a rock that floats in water. This would look exactly like a pumice does under the microscope. And so you've got increasing porosity with increasing shock levels, and that essentially makes these rocks that, again, were not colonizable, it makes them colonizable by endolithic organisms. Why this is important on early Earth and on planets like Mars is that, early crustal rocks, before we have any a water cycle, we're going to have a lot of igneous rocks, dense, non-porous rocks. Same on the surface of Mars with the dominant rock type is basalt, for example. And so, we have impacts all over Mars, all over early Earth. They can not only be forming these kinds of highly porous rocks in the crater, they can be distributing, injecting them onto the surface of the planet, essentially, in big basin-size impacts. Okay, so moving on to the next habitat. I mentioned glass already, and so this is kind of the extreme product, well, not quite as extreme because vapor can be produced during impacts too, but rocks, impact events can melt large volumes of rock. If that melt or that magma is rapidly cooled, you'll form a glass. And so this was the PhD work of Haley Sapers, actually based on samples from the Reese impact structure in Germany. And what she identified were what we called enigmatic tubular features. And so on the 2 images on the left-hand side are taken on a regular optical microscope. The 2 images on the right-hand side are again under a scanning electron microscope. You can see the difference in scale, 2 microns top right, 200 nanometers bottom right, and then 50 and 10 microns on the left. But we see these really neat tubular structures. They're segmented. If you look closely, these are also on the bottom left image in particular. This is a stack of about 100 different images at different focal points in the thin section. And so you're getting a bit of a 3-dimensional perspective. And if you look closely, particularly in the bottom left, you can actually see spirals. And so we've got curved features, ones that spiral, things that are segmented. And actually, if you look closely too, and if I left this up for long enough, you can actually see places where these features are forked. So this is not something you can do with a regular mineral that quenches out of the melt and grows, essentially abiotically. These are also, interestingly, have been documented. And there's a huge body of literature now on these same features in volcanic glasses. And so the top row are actually features from volcanic glasses from various places on Earth. And the bottom row, so E to H, are essentially an equivalent in these impact glasses from the Reese impact structure in Germany. So essentially what we think these are in both settings are essentially trace fossils. What you're looking at here is where organisms have, used the glass as a substrate for life. That organism does not exist anymore, but they've left behind this essential trace of their activity, millions of years ago. Okay, so I've summarized some of the habitats for life. To switch gears a little bit, before kind of wrapping things up today, impacts can also do a lot more. I'm not going to talk, I didn't put a slide in, it's something that's a bit more well-known, but asteroids and comets, of course, can also deliver key ingredients for life. We know in carbonaceous chondrites and in comets that there's a lot of carbon-rich molecules, lots of amino acids, and they can be delivered to the surface of planetary objects. Another really interesting feature is, the role of minerals in the origin of life, which, as a geologist, I find really interesting. And there was some great work done in the mid-2000s showing that clay in particular is able to catalyze a variety of organic reactions. It can essentially make the formation of RNA much more feasible. And that's because, if you've done mineralogy, the top right image is, the crystal structure of a typical clay. These are layered minerals, and there's lots of space between the layers where you can put other cations and other molecules. And that makes them very reactive substrates and very, interesting potential a place in the early origin of life. Why am I telling you anything about this? Well, it turns out that actually from these hydrothermal systems that impacts produce, that clays are abundant. So just one example here, this is a scanned in thin section. So you're looking at an image that's just over 2 by 2 centimeters. The black here is actually glass. These are particles of impact glass. And all of the rest of the green mineral is clay, and actually montmorillonite. So this is in, ejecta deposits, which I think is my next screen. So if many of you are in Europe, this is maybe a site that you've been to. And if you haven't, I would definitely urge you to go. This is from the Ries impact structure in Germany. Very accessible, unlike a lot of the craters I work at in the Canadian Arctic. And this is one of the famous quarries called Amula, which is where we see the ejecta blanket preserved. And there's actually 2 layers of ejecta. The bottom reddish kind of brick red layer is what we call the ballistic ejecta, material thrown out. And then the greenish material here is what we call swavite, or impact melt bearing breccia. And the reason it has this green color is that over half of the volume of this particular rock is clay. And so imagine this very reactive mineral mixed with glass being deposited and blanketed around meteorite impact structures. Okay, so in the remaining 5-10 minutes, let's come back to this hypothesis, which is that impact craters can generate conditions suitable for the emergence of life substrates and the delivery of life essential elements that I haven't covered today, but is also very important. And so I'm going to step you through kind of a couple of summary schematic diagrams from a review paper we put together a couple of years ago. And so if you typically pick up a textbook or a paper on impact craters, you'll see we often talk about impacts as purely a geological process. And we talk about 3 main stages of impact events: contact and compression, excavation and modification. But all of that is very narrow. They focused on the formation of the crater in seconds and minutes. What we've done here is kind of rephrase the formation of a crater, and start looking at impact cratering as a geobiological process. And so we've identified 3 main stages: the thermobaric phase, the hydrothermal phase, and the succession phase. And so the thermobaric phase is that high temperature thermobaric pressure. This is where the crater does look a little bit hellish, quite a challenging environment for life. But even then, some of the key habitats for life, in the bottom left image, this pumice-like material, in the center image is starting to form early clays, lots of glass lying around. You've also created the fraction network. And we also know from looking at impact events that while they appear very catastrophic, you're melting large volumes of rock, bioessential elements are preserved, fossils are preserved as clasts even in these, boiling red hot rocks. But it doesn't take long for the system to be cooling. It will remain hot at depth, but it will cool on the surface. Most craters, because they form such big topographic depressions, will either fill in with groundwater, melting of ground ice, or fill in from precipitation. And so you'll create a crater lake. Those combination of fluid sources will start to generate your hydrothermal system. And again, why it's interesting is that, you know, whether you favor subaerial or submarine hydrothermal systems as an origin of life setting, well, you get both in an impact crater at the same time. So, you know, hydrothermal vents into a crater lake, vents around the crater rim that are venting onto the surface and creating, you know, small ponds that dry out. We think, you know, the wetting and drying cycles might also be important for the origin of life as well. We start to see in the bottom left, you know, the colonization of these impact glasses and the formation of big volumes of clay. The succession phase is interesting. This is where, you know, essentially the crater is starting to be assimilated in the surrounding terrain is starting to revert back to either what the pre-impact setting was like or what the environment has changed to around that crater. So, you know, the preservation of biosignatures becomes quite easy in these lake sediments. And on the bottom right, you know, just as an example, the Horton impact crater on Devon Island formed 31 million years ago, but it still dramatically plays a dramatic role on the distribution of life on present-day Devon Island. It is essentially an oasis for life at the present day, whereas in the surrounding terrain, there's very little going on. And that's because you've got an increased nutrient source. You've got these really quite interesting shocked rocks in the crater at the present day. So on planets like Mars, you know, this succession phase could last billions of years, potentially. Which is a segue into this plot. And so it's quite a busy plot. But you've got, you know, this idea that, you know, on the far right is us today. Mars and Earth look very different. But, you know, I think the more we learn, the more the fact that as we come to the left-hand side, after both those planets were formed, and, you know, I won't even get into Venus on the left, but, you know, potentially all these terrestrial planets looked fairly similar early on. They diverged at some point, but not after, you know, Mars and Earth were fairly similar. We have widespread evidence for surface water. We've got to deal with the loss of the Martian atmosphere. I think there are actually big challenges for, you know, a warm, wet, that's my personal view, a warm, wet early Mars. We're also learning that it was probably quite cold and maybe ice covered. But if impacts, from what I've shown you today, were potentially playing a big role, then, you know, you're depositing this energy enough to make ground ice, enough even into the Amazonian period. And to just take one example, right, hydrated silicates or clays. If you look at where clays have been identified on Mars from orbit, it's pretty much entirely, or the majority, is in what we call the heavily cratered southern highlands. So quickly, for those of you who may not have looked at Mars too much, this is a digital elevation model. So red in the south is high elevation, then you go into the northern lowlands, blue elevation. But that's not as important as all of those little circular features in the south. There are, again, literally thousands of meteorite impact craters in these heavily cratered regions, and more subtle large basins. And so this dashed circle is centered around, it's not named here, but the Isidis impact basin, so where that 90 degrees east symbol is, that's a 1,000-kilometer diameter basin, and it would have deposited ejecta out to that dashed line, ejecta that was likely very rich in clays from hydrothermal alteration. And kind of lo and behold, you know, look at where we have a lot of clay signatures from orbit. And so, you know, potentially a lot of these clays on Mars were not formed within due to endogenic activity, but were actually formed because of these big impact basins forming on early Mars, generating the substrates for life, generating the habitats for life, these shocked rocks, these hydrothermal systems. I'm sure many of you Mars fans, you might be following Perseverance rover. Just, you know, very quickly, Perseverance is exploring this delta system in Jezero crater. It was sent there, and the colors here are to identify different types of clay minerals. You know, they're actually surprisingly not finding lake sediments yet, which I think a lot of people suspected. But I'm actually interested to see what happens as it climbs out on an extended mission out of these craters to see if we'll be able to identify some of these hydrothermal deposits that we find around the rim of the Horton impact crater, for example. And so to basically summarize and conclude, hopefully what I've shown you is that impact cratering is a geological process common to, all planetary bodies in the solar system. I don't think it's speculative to say in the universe, right? Based on what we know of how solar systems form, there's always going to be material left off from planetary accretion. And so that material will impact those planets and moons that are formed until it's all used up. So cratering, unlike volcanism and other geological process, is ubiquitous. Impact events can deliver the chemical ingredients for life. Again, not something I've touched on today, but there's some, in the 1990s, Carl Sagan himself published on this. And, it was shown that a lot of, through the delivery of carbonaceous chondrites and comets, they're rich in volatiles and organic rich materials. We can then generate conditions suitable for the emergence of life, both through substrates. I've mentioned clays, but impacts also generate pyrites or sulfides, this pumice-like material that has also been proposed to be a habitat, a substrate for life, and then the habitats that I focused on a bit more today. And so basically, I'll leave you with this idea that impact craters once formed that may have represented prime sites and protected niches where life could have, definitely survived and evolved and maybe even originated. And I think one last plug, if you're interested in learning more, there's an open access review article on this topic in Astrobiology from 2020. And I will leave it there. And I think even with the delay, we hopefully have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and I hope that you were able to convince all of our listeners about the importance of impact cratering and geology as a whole, as a basis for life. We have a couple of questions, so we will be I will be reading them for you, and if you could comment on that, that would be awesome. We have 14 minutes, so plenty of time. And if you have any other questions, our listeners, just type them up. So Jens Pacek is asking, we know about frequent exchange of material between Mars and Earth because we find Martian meteorites on Earth. Question, does more impact ejecta from Earth hit Mars, or more impact ejecta from Mars hits Earth?
Very interesting. I'm not sure I can click on that link there if you're sharing a paper that maybe answers that question. I'm not aware of anyone's looked at that very recently, but I think the general idea is that it is easier to eject and bring material into the inner solar system from the outer part than it is to go the other way. And so, I think there's definitely more material from more material from Mars that has reached Earth than the other way around. It is, I've been to some astrobiology talks where, the people will speculate and throw out the idea, right, that we may all be Martians. Life, if panspermia works in a short distance from Mars to Earth, life could have originated on Mars and been brought to Earth. Who knows? But it's definitely theoretically possible. Just quickly, maybe before Anya asks me another question, there's actually this intriguing idea, and we may have found there's potentially something in the Apollo collection. There's probably a lot of material from early Earth that is no longer preserved here on the moon. And so, we could have meteorites from Earth on the surface of the moon that, perhaps we'll find one day, from that 4.5 to 4 billion year time period, which should be, pretty fun to think about from an astrobiology perspective. Perfect.
Okay, another question from Mikołaj Kuska. Are there any known candidates for organisms able to settle inside impact glass and form those tubes? And he's not sure if he understood it correctly.
So I think people have, speculated what kinds of organisms. They're going to have to be Well, so quickly back up. No one has yet identified the organism. You know, people have. So what we've done is been able to detect, you know, chemical traces. So sometimes, if you're lucky, there's differences in ion speciation. There's, you know, mapped carbon, different carbon molecules around these tubes, but nothing kind of living, no smoking gun in the tube. The Reese examples are about 14 million years old. These features were found in, I think the youngest is these Ontong Java Plateau basalts, which I believe are less than 1 million years. And it's my understanding that people have tried to culture, you know, these organisms, but have just had no luck. I think the idea is that they're perhaps, you know, it's so slow growing that, you know, we've got to wait an eternity for anything to kind of happen in a lab environment. So I hope that answers your question.
And if not, you can ask again, because there's still time. We have another question that is related to the previous question from Priya Das Sarma. So to piggyback on this question, when would the organism have been there, at or after the impact, or from they came from elsewhere?
Another great question. We don't know is the honest answer. And there's lots, you know, a lot of the stuff I've talked today, there's not too many people working on it. And so if there are students and young professional, early career folks out there, you know, come and join Anya and I and work on impacts, because there's not enough of us. I would say that it is likely that they've come from elsewhere. You know, how far that is, if it was just around the rim region of a crater or 1,000 kilometers away, we don't know. You know, one of the interesting things is not associated with the tubules, but for example, at the Horton crater in the Arctic, there's an isotopic signature in sulfur isotopes for thermophilic organisms. So there's heat-loving organisms. Well, you know, that's the Arctic, which even 30 million years ago was very cold. And so, you know, somehow through, you know, the airstream, all those organisms, or through, you know, the oceans and things, that those organisms somehow found their way into this meteorite impact crater. So elsewhere is probably the short version of that long-winded answer to your question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. There is a comment from Jan Spacek to also add something to the question of Mikołaj. So he said, we showed that some volcanic gases catalyze production of RNA under primordial conditions, and shared his paper. So if you are us or other of our listeners interested, please check it out later on. We have another question. Magdalena Bardanowska asks, how possible is it to find biosignatures, for example, at the Zero crater, and what can we expect to find there?
Oh, great question. One I think about often, right? I think as they, you know, get to, they're in these kind of units right now that they seem to be, you know, volcanic, right? Which I think was unexpected from initial findings. But in some of the sedimentary units, and I think as they start to explore the delta more and move out of the crater, you know, initially what we could be looking for is probably biosignatures that are not in situ, would be my guess. You know, the nice thing about that delta is that you've brought in material from the heavily cratered highlands outside Jezero. And so, you know, perhaps you'll find cobbles, grains of material from outside, from impacts that, you know, may contain biosignatures. So let's, for example, take, you know, glass. Maybe you have fragments of glass, impact glass, either from Jezero or other impacts that had those tubular organisms at some point, and then they've been eroded and brought in. And so, you know, if they identify anything that looks remotely like glass, you know, impact, you know, to me that would be a high priority sampling target. The clays that we're identifying, again, I think based on what we're currently seeing, are likely not formed in situ from impacts, but they could be eroded into Jezero from outside where they could have been impact generated. Perhaps as we get further out, you might start to see things that are in situ, in perhaps hydrothermal deposits or in the actual ejecta deposits from Jezero will be amazing to see.
Are any of those potential targets have any features that are identifiable with the instruments that are already on Mars, or would we have to get those samples on Earth to be able to see them?
I think a bit of both. We will. Well, I mean, unequivocally saying that it's glass with the current instruments on board is going to be difficult. If it was Curiosity with the Chemin instrument, when it was working, it's possible there. Saying they have enough spectrometers that we should be able to identify clay minerals, and so that's definitely possible. But I do think because a lot of these, those tubules are microscopic, and I think the biosignatures will be microscopic, and so I really do think that even with the high-res, the macro images they have on the weathered Martian surface, I don't think we're going to see anything, and so absolutely, it's a case for bringing back those samples to Earth to look at in our labs.
Oh, let's hope it will happen within our lifetime. We have one more question from Marek Naharnovich. We know Miller early experiments to create removal environment. Does anyone try it at bigger scale using our current knowledge about help that minerals can provide for life's creation?
I am not aware of anyone trying to, replicate that exact Miller-Urey experiment with, let's say clays in the system as well. Others maybe on this call out there do, but I'm not aware of that. It's even on its own right been an experiment that's not been reproduced many times. So the answer is no. I mean, people have done smaller scale experiments, right, on the clay minerals and how they can act as catalysts for the formation of RNA, but not perhaps that big picture complete origin of life experiment.
Yeah. Okay, we have one more question from Mikołaj Kuska, which is related to Magdalena Baranowska's question. How to find sufficient background negative sample for this experiment, meaning finding the biomarkers in the Jezero crater. What can be used as this kind of background negative samples?
So this is getting to, I'm just trying to understand the question. If we're framing the experiment here as in, let's say, looking for, biosignatures and impact-produced rocks, perhaps some of the negative test samples might be the quite coarse-grained igneous rocks that Perseverance rovers already found. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's potentially what comes to mind.
I think that the following comment is from Jan Spacek, is related to that.
Yeah, I'm only seeing the one active comment on my screen right now.
So I will read it. He said that they found there are some papers on the tube-like features that have been produced by abiotic processes. So I guess that the question from Mikołaj would be how do you ensure that the samples you brought you are able to properly analyze and after that if there are those tubes, they are produced by some Martian organisms, not something abiotic.
Yeah.
Any ideas about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just looking over, and I'm aware of that most recent article, there's definitely, there's been some questioning of the biogenicity of the tubules in both volcanic and impact settings. But we're for these Reese ones, I would say we have controls in these same glasses where we have beautiful quench crystals, right, which are well known. They are definitely abiotic. Those are crystals that form when you rapidly cool and melt, and we have them in the same thin section as these tubular structures. And so if they're abiotic, you've got to explain it. Perhaps someone will come along and come up with an abiotic origin that no one has thought about. And that's what science is all about, right? Is making progress and learning new things. But for now, we have no other explanation than a biological origin for those tubules. But thanks for the paper link. I'll take a read.
Me too. Perfect. Thank you very much, Oz. It was an excellent presentation, excellent questions answers session. And right now, I think I would like to invite you to our session in which we'll be able to meet other people through the networking device that is available through the Hopin platform. So please go there and come back to participate in the presentations from our other speakers. The first session will be on planetary geology. We will move from Earth to Mars and Venus. So very, very exciting locations and topics. And I hope that also you will be able to hang out with us for the next sessions and also maybe answer some questions in the networking session.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks, Anya. And I think my camera's disappeared, but thank you. I enjoyed the questions, and I'll definitely try and join in the networking section. If I can drop in and out of this afternoon's session, I will do.
Perfect. Thank you so much.